Hi guys, it's me, Mr. Wilson, and I'm here with Chapter 3. So, once again, thanks to StacyPlays and HarperCollins Publishing for letting me read their book. So we're on to Chapter 3, and there's chickens on the title page. Stacy and the wolves all breathed a sigh of relief when Everest and Noah sauntered into the cave. The noise hadn't been a farmer, just the sound of the two largest members of the pack returning from the morning's rescue. Stacy shot Everest a look that said, "Let's talk later. Alone." The massive wolf nodded. That was the thing about Stacy's wolves. She discovered that the first fateful day in the forest that these particular wolves could understand her perfectly, even though they lacked the ability to speak back. And they'd learned over the years to communicate with Stacy in other ways, either through facial expressions or body language. Stacy had gotten pretty good at reading them. Might Everest already know about the problem with the other wolves? He had the kind of sixth sense about the taiga and the animals that lived in it. He seemed to be able to read the mind of the forest. Stacy didn't know if Everest sensed something was wrong. Maybe he just wanted to scold her again for this morning's dangerous rescue mission. Either way, it would have to wait. Stacy took the last bite of her sandwich and then stood up and brushed the crumbs from her jeans. She couldn't help smiling at Wink as Wink scarfed them up, his tail wagging back and forth with each nibble. Stacy could see by the way the sunlight shone on the spruce trees outside the cave entrance that it was the mid-afternoon. They had a couple hours of daylight left, and there was work to be done before the loss of light. "Time for chores," she announced, grabbing her stone axe from beside the fireplace. "Addie, can you pull the lever, please?" Addison trotted over to the dog decider, a rather rustic Rube Goldberg machine that she and Stacy had built together. What had started out as a self-assigned engineer homework project had turned out to be a remarkably useful tool for deciding which of the wolves got to help Stacy for the chores on that given day. And there's a picture of Stacy, the wolf decider, and her wolves lying by the fire, licking up the crumbs. So the wolf decider is looks like a wheel, like a Wheel of Fortune wheel. Addison took a wooden lever between her teeth and pulled. The lever knocked a small pine cone out of the wood cup and into an old bird's nest that sat on top of the apex of a wheel made of curved twigs that had been tightly woven together. The force of the pine cone turned the wheel, knocking the pine cone into a hollow tube made of birch bark that led to 6 others. Stacy pulled a second lever that caused the tubes to shift back and forth. She never knew which tube the pine cone would end up in, but that determined the winner, or perhaps the loser, depending on the chores that Stacy had planned for that day. The rock landed in front of one of the 6 objects, each one representing a different wolf in Stacy's pack. Noah's object was a piece of blue beach glass he discovered during a pack trip to the ocean biome that was to the east of them. Tucker's was a shiny copper penny, and Everest was a piece of strong, sturdy quartz. Addison was represented by a tiny pencil that had been sharpened past the point of being useful for writing, and Basil by a yellow dandelion Stacy had plucked from the forest and dried. Wink's object was a small red pocket knife he dug up near a campsite one day, its blade too rusty to use. Stacy walked toward the cave entrance. Tucker stopped her on her way out. He had a scarf in his mouth. "Thanks, Tuck," she said. "You're right, the late afternoons still get chilly." She wrapped the scarf around her neck and looked around the cave again. "Where did I leave my bag?" Before she spotted it, Basil retrieved Stacy's satchel from the shelf in the back of the cave. She darted over to Stacy with it, Addison on her heels. Stacy took the bag from Basil with one hand and held out the other for Addison, who dropped the red pocket knife into her palm. "Thank you, Basil. Thank you, Addison," she said. "Wink, you're up." Wink didn't budge. Normally all the wolves jumped at a chance to help Stacy with her chores, except for Wink. Wink wasn't interested, unless there was an adventure involved. But today was a farming and wood-cutting day, and Wink was apparently aware of that fact. "Wink!" Wink slowly started to stand, but Everest pushed past him and planted himself solidly by Stacy's side. "Scratch that," Stacy said. "Wink, you've been spared. Come on, Everest." Wink excitedly spun around in place several times and plopped back down on the floor while Everest followed Stacy out of the cave. Stacy knew why Everest had volunteered. It would give her a chance to talk to him alone. Stacy stepped into the forest and immediately took a deep breath of pine and spruce scented air she'd come to love. She'd seen pictures in books and newspapers of countries and cities around the world. She'd seen photos of tropical islands and beaches and mountain biomes, but she couldn't imagine any biome more beautiful than their taiga forest. Stacy and Everest started walking south of the cave toward the forest. Through the forest, an ancient stream had formed their cave thousands of years ago. It was dug into a side of a steep ridge that towered over tall pines and spruce trees that surrounded it. The ridge was of an ideal vantage point from which to guard against any threats to Stacy and her wolves. Stacy also liked to climb up there to survey the world around her. From the top she could see the taiga forest stretch as far south as any eye, human or wolf, could see. To the east was a deep ravine that separated the taiga from a giant oak forest. Entrances to the old abandoned iron mine could be found all along the ravine. That was a place Stacy generally avoided, always aware that there could be a sudden cave-in. Even further to the east, beyond the old oak forest, was the beach. That was the farthest Stacy and the wolves had ever traveled from their cave, and they'd only done it one time. It was the summer after Stacy had first read Island of the Blue Dolphins, and she begged the wolves to show her the ocean. To the west, on either side of the river, was the forest filled with towering birch trees. Even further west and a bit to the north was the set of rolling hills that became low mountains. Directly north of the ridge was a swamp lands, a patch of forest that was permanently covered in a gray mist. A murky lake sat in the center of the swamp. On the rare occasions that Noah fished there instead of the river, he always came back covered in slimy sludge and smelling of rotten plants. And lastly, even further north were tall, rugged mountains with snow-peaked tops year-round. The base of the extreme mountains was covered by a forest so dense it blocked out the sky to create a never-ending night. Stacy called the area the Forest of Perpetual Darkness. Stacy and her wolves had never had any reason to go there, and her wolves had always balked at Stacy's desire to explore it in the past. While she and Everest walked through the forest, she quietly told him what she had read in the newspaper. "If we can persuade the other wolf pack to leave, I think the attention will die down," she said. "Do you think they'll go?" Everest shook his head. "Is there better hunting anywhere else?" Stacy asked. But she knew the answer was no. There was no more than enough white-tailed deer and mule deer and even moose to keep them satiated here in the taiga. Come to think of it, why had they risked leaving and being shot by a farmer in the first place? "We should at least warn the other wolves about the bounty," Stacy continued. "Can't you explain it to them in wolf speak? I'll come with you." Everest shot her a look that said, "Yeah, right." Sometimes Stacy forgot that not all wolves were as comfortable around humans as her pack was. It hadn't been until her first run with a wild pack that she learned wolves are naturally scared of humans. They most certainly do not understand English the way her wolf pack was somehow able to. Stacy and Everest walked in silence for a little while. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though. It was the kind of quiet moment only two best friends could share. Each of them was completely at ease with the other and could allow their minds to wander while they walked. Even though Stacy was pretty sure Everest never really allowed his mind to actually wander. That was the thing about Everest. He was always extremely present, keeping one step ahead of Stacy and looking out for danger. Stacy's eyes began to well with tears. She knew she hadn't been entirely successful in explaining the seriousness of the wolf bounty to Everest. For as long as she could remember, she had always been afraid that she'd have to leave the wolves. She didn't know how she knew, but she believed that if humans discovered her, they'd force her to leave the life of the wild that she loved so much. It may have sounded strange to humans, but Stacy had no recollection of her family from before. This was her family, and as far as she was concerned, the only one that mattered. Which was the idea of a wolf bounty going to affect which was why the idea of a wolf bounty going into effect and one of her wolves being taken from her, being killed, was a new fear, an entirely different level. And Stacy couldn't bear the thought of it. Stacy was relieved when she looked up and realized they had arrived at their destination. She could focus on her chores. Everest walked up to the cluster of a tall spruce tree and grew that grew so close together you could barely see between them, and began pawing at the ground. "Here, I'll help you, boy," said Stacy as she caught up to him. She reached down and grabbed a hold of the sheet of pine branches and dead root that were bound together to create a crude trap door. Together they lifted the makeshift covering to reveal a wolf-sized tunnel in the ground. Everest and Stacy wriggled through the short underground passageway that dipped a few feet beneath the cluster of thick trees and popped up on the other side of the small sun-drenched clearing. There, in the protection of the giant spruce trees, was Stacy's small farm. It wasn't much, but just a little patch of earth Stacy called a farm, with a few carrots, pumpkins, potatoes, and herbs she planted, along with a hen, a rooster, and a half a dozen of baby chicks milling about. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a fistful of seeds, scattering them around. Fluff the hen and her little chicks eagerly pecked at them. The rooster crow stood back as if he was too dignified to vie for food with his chicks, but then swept in to eat up what they appeared to be finished. Next, Stacy took her metal canteen, left months ago hanging on a tree branch by a camper, out of her satchel and poured some water into a shallow bowl in the corner of the clearing. Everest lovingly nudged the baby chicks toward it. Stacy didn't know how he could be so loving toward something he would eventually eat. Stacy was more happy to stick to her diet of fish, vegetables, berries, and the occasional treat Addison swiped from a campsite. But the wolves couldn't properly digest anything other than meat. They had given up hunting when they took Stacy in, and Stacy could get them to eat some berries now and then when they were in season in the wild. She eventually had to start supplementing their diet with chicken. She knew wolves needed meat to survive. It was a part of the circle of life, hence Fluff and Crow. She raised Fluff from when she was just a little yellow fluff ball like the chicks scampering about her feet now. Stacy shuddered to think of the task ahead of her in a few months when the chicks were grown. She didn't like to dwell on that part, so she pushed that thought out of her mind. "Let's not name the chicks, okay?" she said, partly to herself. "It's bad enough I named Fluff and Crow." After the chickens were fed, Everest used his paws to dig up a small bunch of carrots, while Stacy used an old wooden hoe to uproot a potato. She filled her satchel with a small haul, and then she and Everest exited the clearing via the dirt tunnel, making sure to close the branch door behind them. On the way back to the cave, Stacy spotted a birch sapling about the same height as her that had sprouted too close to a pine tree. "That'll never get enough sunlight to grow taller," That'll never get enough sunlight to grow taller, Everest, she said. "Let's cut it up for kindling." Stacy reached for her stone axe hanging from her satchel and went to work breaking down the sapling into small twigs. As the sun was dipping below the tree line, she loaded the final stack of kindling into her pack that hung on Everest's back. "Good job today, boy," Stacy said as they walked through the rest of the way home. "Thanks for all your help," she thought back to the rabbit rescue earlier that day at the waterfall. Was that really just this morning? Stacy could tell Everest was still upset that he hadn't managed to stop her from jumping off the waterfall. Come to think of it, he'd been acting pretty sullen ever since. She'd have to make it up to him somehow, and she knew just the thing to improve his mood. She dug into her satchel, searching below the potatoes and carrots for Everett's favorite toy, 2 old bones Stacy had found in the forest and lashed together with a piece of string. Stacy called it a throw bone. "Hey boy," Stacy said, "want to play fetch?" Everett's ears perked up, and at the sight of his toy, he shook off his pack and took off running before Stacy had even raised her arm to throw. She hurled the bones as far as she could, and a few seconds later, Everest returned with it in his teeth, looking much happier than he had a few minutes before. They got so caught up in their game that Stacy didn't notice the changes in the light until it was hard to see the throw bone flying through the air. The sun had completely vanished behind the trees. "Hurry, Everest," she said. "We have to get back. The others will be howling for their dinner." End of chapter 3. Ooh, so this is getting interesting. And chapter 4 is really short. So tomorrow night I will be reading chapter 4. I hope you guys are enjoying this as much as I am. I love StacyPlays. Look up her YouTube channel. She has a lot of cool Minecraft series, which I know some of you really like. So once again, thanks for watching. I love you guys, and I will see you later. Bye!